Hello and Assalamu alaikum, all of you. I welcome you all on behalf of Global Information Security Society for Professionals of Pakistan. As you know that we have been carrying out sessions for the preparation of CRISC examination. The first two domains were covered by one of our colleague, Mohammad Adnan Khan, in which he had discussed domain 1 and domain 2. Now I have been given, this responsibility to cover up the other two domains, which is domain 3 and domain 4. Domain 3 is largely on risk response and mitigation. But before we begin, what I'll do is that I'll introduce myself. I'm Muneeb Imran Shaikh. I have been working with telecommunication industry largely for over 11 years, and I have recently started working in the financial sector with one of the reputable banks in Saudi Arabia. Uh, I have done the certifications for CISSP, CRISC, CCSP, and Agile certification. I'm, a keen reader on materials such as GRC, and the other things that I am particularly interested in is malware analysis, threat intelligence. So these are some of the areas that I'm particularly interested in. If you want to have more details about me, you can reach out to me on LinkedIn. You can have my profile, and if you have any queries, you can contact me over there. So without wasting any further time, what I'll do is that I'll jump right on to the topic. So let's begin the third domain. Now, if you see, risk management is a cyclical process. This must have been covered by in the earlier sessions also. So this is a phase that continues to go on. So this is a continuous phase where the risk management is largely divided into four different sections. The first one being risk identification, then the results from risk identification are fed into the risk assessment, and the results from risk assessment are fed to risk response and mitigation. And then the last phase is the risk and control monitoring and reporting. But you see that from here, the results from here are then again fed into the risk identification phase. So you see, this is a cyclical process, but since today we are focusing on the risk response and mitigation, so I'll just go back for a minute on risk assessment phase and how it gets linked with the risk response and mitigation. So at the conclusion of the IT risk assessment phase, the risk practitioner compiles the results of the risk assessment into a comprehensive report for the senior management to have a look at it. And what happens is that this once this report is prepared, you also update your risk register, and the assessment of this phase, risk assessment phase, is fed into the risk response and mitigation phase. And the factors that you keep in view to determine a risk response are: the first thing is the budget. Do you have the capacity to sponsor a particular risk response? Do you have the time available? What are the resources at your disposal? What are the strategic plans? How does a particular risk response or a mitigation option will align with your strategic plan? If there are any regulatory compulsions that you have, and what are the customer expectations from associated to your organization? Now, the first thing is to align your risk response with your business objectives. Now, as I mentioned in the previous slide as well, that you have a risk assessment report and an updated risk register after the risk assessment phase, which indicates the priority of each risk. So now what happens is that management is responsible for evaluating and responding to these recommendations which are sent from these reports. And how do they do that? They first determine the best risk response. How do they determine the best risk response? This is something that we will check further. Then based on, once they have determined the best risk response, then they develop an action plan for this. And for the action plan, they develop an implementation strategy. Now, this is not a silver bullet. This is something that is, just to give you an idea about the chain of actions that are adopted by the various organizations. They may be worded in a different manner, but you have to understand largely, how these things work. Now, what are the 4 risk response options that you have? Uh, First one is the risk acceptance, then you have risk mitigation, risk sharing, or risk transfer, or the risk avoidance. Now, what I'll try and do is that I'll try and relate this to, to our daily lives as much as I can, and this will be a suggestion also going forward and while you're preparing for the examination, or even in professional life. These topics are quite closer to our daily life as well. It's just that if we try and relate these things to our daily life, we will start understanding these concepts much more easily. So the first option that you have is the acceptance of risk. Now, uh, this decision has to be made in accordance with your risk appetite and your risk tolerance. How much risk can you absorb? This is how we usually behave in our daily life as well. Whatever spending that we make, it has to be in line with our risk appetite. Can we, so let's say if I'm taking, if I decide to purchase a car on a lease, so what I'll do is that I will first evaluate that what is my risk appetite. Can I make can I run my house by leasing an expensive car? So again, these are daily life decisions as well. So, whatever risk response you adopt, it has to be in line with your risk appetite and your. So, the choice to accept the risk is a conscious decision that is made by the senior management, and this is done by recognizing that there is an existence of risk, and then knowingly, you decide whether to assume to allow the risk or leave it without any kind of mitigation. So, and management remains responsible for the impact of the risk, even should it ever occur. So the decision to accept a risk is again made in accordance with your risk appetite and the risk tolerance, which would be set earlier by the senior management. And one thing that is important to mention over here is that the risk acceptance is not same as risk ignorance. Risk ignorance is more about the failure to identify or acknowledge that the risk exists, or just the blind acceptance of risk without knowing or acknowledging what the risk level really is. So this is one thing, and the acceptance of risk has to be done by someone who is empowered enough to act on behalf of the organization, who can take responsibility of the projected consequences which are associated with the risk. Now, risk tolerance can play an important role in the acceptance of the risk itself, and this is usually important where in two cases when there are no controls that are available to mitigate the risk further, or the cost of controls outweigh their benefits. And the example is the self-insurance. So one common example for risk acceptance that I will give is that, so let's say that if you decide to travel intercity from one city to the other through the highway, through your own car, and you realize that your car wheels have fair bit of wear and tear on them, but you decide that okay, that there is wear and tear on your wheels, but you do not have the sufficient budget to reduce this risk. So what you decide is that okay, I'll accept this risk is within my risk appetite. I can still travel safely. There won't be any issues to me during the journey, and I can reach safely. So what you decide is that you continue to travel with the same wheels without having replaced them. So this is what you're doing, is that you are essentially accepting the risk. But again, this has to be a thought through decision. It does not have to be a blind acceptance of risk. Then, in addition to the acceptance of risk, organizations also need to recognize the other approaches to the risk management, which at times yield residual risk. Residual risk is something that I will cover in the later slides as well. But just to give you a brief over here, residual risk is the leftover risk, which you have after some sort of a risk response has already been employed. And again, risk response is not a one-time process. The level of risk and its potential impact can change dramatically, because if the assets increase or decrease in value, if new threats emerge, sometimes what happens is that the attackers gain additional skills or motivation, and sometimes new vulnerabilities are discovered, and the existing controls tend to become weaker, and sometimes the operation teams start becoming less diligent in their report. So these are all the factors that mandate the requirement, that mandate reviewing the entire risk acceptance procedure again. Let me attend to some of the questions. I would suggest asking the questions at the end, because the session would be short. Oh, God forbid, if I'm not able to answer the questions, what you can do is that you can reach out to me on my LinkedIn profile that I have mentioned earlier. But what I can assure you is that I'll definitely get back to you with with my answers to the questions that you would have raised to me. So the next option that you have is the risk mitigation. So risk mitigation is basically the reaction that the organization takes in order to reduce a risk, and it is usually achieved through some kind of a security control, which will either affect the frequency or the impact of the risk. So if you see, risk is determined by what? By the frequency and the impact. So when you employ a certain security control, what you try and do is that either you reduce the frequency or you reduce the impact of the risk. So the choices for risk mitigation can be determined in part by the scope of the risk, or by the speed at which the incident can expand. So going back to the same example of traveling intercity through your own car. So as I mentioned, that if you realize that your car wheels had wear and tear on them, and then you decided that, yeah, I need to go for a replacement of my car wheels. So maybe your budget may not allow you to replace all the four wheels. Well, if it does, then what you can do is that you can replace all the four car wheels. But if it doesn't allow, so one of the options that people usually adopt is that they replace the front wheels first, and they replace the rear wheels later on. So in this case, what you have done is that you have reduced the risk to a sufficient level. Again, what you need to make sure that the risk reduction is done in a manner that it falls within your risk appetite. Your risk appetite would be that you want to travel safely. You don't want to have any kind of, you don't want to put yourself or your family in any kind of a hazardous situation during the journey, and you need to make sure that you reach your destination safely and securely. So going back to the same example, so if you have reduced, if you have replaced the front wheels of your car, what you have done is that you have reduced the risk, and the remaining two wheels which are not replaced, this becomes your residual risk. This becomes your leftover risk. This leftover risk is considered as the risk which is accepted, and all this risk has to be reviewed from time to time. The third option that we have here is the risk transfer, or the risk sharing. Now, risk transfer is a decision where you reduce loss by having another organization to pay the cost. And the most common example that you see for risk transfer is the purchasing of insurance itself. And this is usually employed when the probability of an event is extremely low, or the frequency of the event is low, but the impact that it is going to cause is high. One of the examples being natural disasters. So again, as for all the other risk of the response options that we had, transfer risk also needs to be reviewed on a regular basis to ensure that it remains appropriate and adequate. And partnerships are a mean to one way of transferring the risk, in which you share the loss and the profits among the partners. One of the confusion that I myself had, and this is something that I wanted to highlight over here, is about the ownership of risk when the risk is transferred to the other organizations. When you purchase an insurance, so what you are doing is that you transfer the risk. So again, for a moment, if I go back to the same example that I had discussed about of traveling intercity through your own car. So in this case also, so let's say if you decided not to replace the wheels of your car, but you had the full insurance cover to protect you for any kind of a hazard during your journey. So what you have done is that you have essentially transferred the risk that God forbid that there happens to be any incident or accident during your journey. So your insurance cover will protect you from the potential loss that you are going to face due to that incident. Coming back to the ownership confusion, transferring of risk basically indemnifies the organization only contractually, because you have an insurance company that will cover the impact of the realized risk. But the blame of the risk event still gets attached to the risk owner itself. So as long as I'm involved in any activity that that can pose any kind of a risk, I continue to remain answerable for that risk. It's just that the risk that the insurance will guard me against the potential loss, maybe in the monetary terms. Okay, but the blame still remains attached to the risk owner itself. Okay, what is the last option that we have over here? It's the risk avoidance. So it is a choice that is usually adopted when no other response is adequate, or when some of the options that, this is an option that is adopted when the following conditions are true, where the exposure level is considered unacceptable by the management. So I assume that in the earlier domain, it was discussed with you people that what are the acceptable, there are three levels that management considers. One is acceptable, unacceptable, there was one more. So when the exposure level is considered unacceptable by the management, this is considered, in such cases you go for risk avoidance. And when you cannot transfer the risk, in such cases also you go for the risk avoidance. And where the cost of risk related to the business process is greater than the potential opportunity. So let's say if I'm going to make $5,000 out of a particular risk-based activity, and the cost of the risk that it is going to, if it is going to cost me much more than $5,000, I may not go for that risk activity, because the cost of the risk is much higher than the amount of profit that I'm going to make out of it. So, and bear in mind that this is the only risk response option that indemnifies the organization legally, because what you're doing is that you are stopping being involved in that risk-based activity. So since you're not involved in that risk-based activity, therefore this is the only risk response option in which you are indemnified legally. I think that the exam is going to test you on this as well. Now we have seen all the risk responses. The next part is to check what are the analysis techniques for the various risk response options. The first thing that we have to think of is what are the factors affecting risk response. First, you have to check the priority of risk in the risk assessment report. So once you have the risk assessment report, there will be a kind of a risk map that will indicate the priority of all the risks that are included in them. The second thing is what are the recommended controls from the risk assessment report. What is the cost? And again, the cost is not limited to just the acquisition cost. It includes your licensing cost, your training, your human resource cost, your maintenance cost. You have to keep in view your compliance and your regulatory requirements. How does a particular risk response option gets aligned with the strategy of the organization? How those risk response options are compatible with the existing controls in place? Do you have the resources available, which can be the time, budget, and the human resources, etc. Now, in order to present to go for a particular risk response, what you need to do is that you need to establish a business case. So these business cases serve as the tools against you can evaluate and support investments throughout their life cycles. And two of the most common analysis techniques that are used for preparation of a business case are one is the cost benefit analysis, and the second one is the return on investment. So the first one being the cost benefit analysis. This is used to justify the expenses of the controls, because whenever you are going to purchase or think of deploying a certain control, you have to evaluate what is the cost associated with that. Does that cost justify making such an expense, and how it is going to reduce the likelihood and the impact of the risk, how it can help you mitigate the risk itself. So the cost, and again, the cost and the benefits can be calculated using the qualitative or the quantitative method. So if you see over here, you have the cost of acquisition and you have the cost of maintenance. So the cost of acquisition could be the evaluation of the solutions of, and the cost of the solution itself, the cost of the control, if there is any cost of training associated, what will be the cost to re-architect the systems, and you have the maintenance cost in terms of licensing cost. Maintenance cost is usually much more than the initial cost. And what will be the cost for having the staff to monitor and report on those controls, and the cost of technical assistance that you may need later on. Then again, you have to evaluate the benefits that are going to be realized from the controls by incorporating the control itself, how it will reduce the cost of the risk event, how it can increase the confidence of customer within your on your organization, how it can improve your recovery procedures, how it can improve your employee relationships. So all are the benefits. So these are all the benefits that you have to keep in view while you're performing a cost benefit analysis. The second technique that you have to that you can use is the return on investment. In information security, this is often regarded as ROSI, return on security investment. Now, in information security, the return on investment is not necessarily in monetary terms, because information security is more of a cost eating, division. It is not generating the profits on its own, but what it does is that it will help you in other ways, as some of the benefits that were highlighted over here. So return on investment is about calculating how long would it take for your organization to reap the benefits out of the implemented controls. The only challenge with the calculation of the ROI is that it is often quite difficult to predict the likelihood of a successful risk event, especially in case of the where you're not particularly aware of the factors that will trigger the likelihood of a particular risk event. But you in this case, what you need to understand is that the ROI will not necessarily be calculated in the financial terms. It will more be in terms of your qualitative, it will be evaluated in more in the qualitative manner. Now, if you check our very first slide, it was about determining the best risk response. We have discussed right now what are the various risk response options. How do we determine the risk response? The next part is the developing a risk action plan. So in this case, before we develop a risk action plan, it is important to remember two fundamental concepts here: that the ultimate decision on a risk response lies with the risk owner, and the risk practitioner can only provide advice on the technologies and the policies and the procedures, and which controls will be effective, etc. But the ownership, the decision to adopt or employ a particular risk response remains with the risk owner itself. Again, the factors that affect The implementation of a certain controls include the applicable laws and the regulations, the availability of the staff, the budget that you have available with you, what are the current risk levels, the perceptions, and your public pressure. These are some of the factors that determine whether which control you are going to employ. But there are certain questions that need to be answered while you select a particular control. These are mentioned over here again, starting from the effectiveness of the control. What would be the satisfactory ROI that your control is going to provide to you? Then, does the organization have the sufficient skill to implement or configure and maintain the control? This is something that I will cover further. Okay. And do you have sufficient budget and the time to implement the control? And what would be the cost of the control itself to operate on an annual basis, and how it would impact your productivity? And one more thing that I want to mention over here is that risk action planning has to be treated as a project with a defined start and end date, and the end date is often used to determine the critical part of the project, where you have to identify those elements of the project that can directly impact the end date. Uh, so the thing is that you need to identify those areas during the entire risk action plan, or those deliverables that are going to impact your the end date of your risk action plan, and focus on those areas specifically. Now, what are the parameters that you have to keep in view for risk response selection? The first is the cost of the response. Now, this can be the cost of the insurance premium or the cost of controls itself, in case you're going for a risk mitigation. The second thing is the importance of risk. This can be the position of the risk on the risk map, which should be derived from the combined value of the likelihood and impact. The third thing is the capability to implement a certain response. So, what happens is that when organizations are mature in risk management processes, they usually go for more sophisticated response. So, when organizations are mature, it allows them to employ or implement more sophisticated responses. But when organizations are rather wise or rookie, I would say, they go for some basic responses. Again, related with a life. So let's say if I do not have the capability for doing a certain task, what I'll do is that if I have the capability, I'll try and do it on my own. If I don't have the capability, what I would do is that I would try and purchase those services or outsource that piece of work to someone else to do it for me. The fourth thing is the effectiveness of response. Effectiveness of response is the extent to which your response, your risk response, will reduce either the frequency or the impact of the risk. And the last is the efficiency of the response. It is the assumed benefits or the projected benefits that are promised by the particular risk response. Now, the next thing is, how do you prioritize? Now, what you have done is that you have evaluated, the multiple risk responses for all the risks that were highlighted during the risk identification and the risk assessment phase. Now you have determined, okay, which risk response is appropriate for each risk item. But it is quite likely that the amount of effort required for the mitigation or the transfer will exceed the resources that your organization has. So in this case, you need a prioritization. You need to prioritize those risk responses. And you can do that by classifying them into three categories. One is the business case, the other one being quick wins, and the third one being deferring the risk response. So if you see, this image is taken from ISACA risk ID framework. So if you see over here, you have the effectiveness to cost ratio, and here you have the risk levels. So the first option that you have is the quick win. In this case, you see the effectiveness to cost ratio is quite high, but the risk level is also quite high. So what you do is that you adopt those risk response options which are very efficient and effective, which again go back to these areas that I had mentioned over here. Effectiveness of the response will help you in reducing the likelihood and the impact. So in this case, you have the quick wins, or what you call low hanging fruits. This is something that you can employ quickly and reduce the risk levels into the risk levels which are within your risk appetite. The second option is the business case. If you check over here, the risk level is higher, but the effectiveness to cost ratio is less. But since the risk level is high, so you have to act upon it. Over here, the risk level is low, but the effectiveness to cost ratio is quite high. So over here, what you have to do is that you have to develop a business case to justify the benefit, to justify the cost associated with it. And how you do that, you can do that going back to the same techniques where you develop, where you perform a ROI analysis, or you do a cost benefit analysis to develop a business case. The third option you can see over here is about deferring a particular risk response. In this case, you see the effectiveness to cost ratio is quite low, and the risk level is low as well. So what you can do is that you can defer a particular risk response. Now, what is the risk response process? This is more of a recap of the discussion that we have had so far. Now, if you see we had developed a risk scenario. We would have developed multiple risk scenarios during the risk identification phase. And these risk scenarios drove the need for a risk analysis and a risk assessment. So during the risk analysis, you have, after the risk analysis, you have a risk map where each risk will indicate the priority of each risk and in terms of the severity levels. So from there you decide, okay, which risk is exceeding you appropriate, whether you have to avoid the risk, mitigate it, transfer it, or to accept it. And how do you decide that? You have to keep in view the various risk response parameters which I discussed over here. It's just that it's been reworded in a different manner over here. So once you have selected the risk response, what you do is that you document it. Then I apologize, the risk response parameters were the ones which were mentioned over here. Okay, not this one. So once you have the multiple risk responses documented, then what you do is that you prioritize all those risk responses based on the risk response prioritization. So high priority ones are the ones which are quick wins. Normal priority ones are the ones in which you need to develop a business case, and low priority ones are those that can be deferred to a certain point in time. Again, this image was taken from ISACA CRISC manual. Now comes the real stage. Now you see, over here you have to start working over the controls. Now you have gone through the entire risk identification and the assessment phase, and you have dealt with the prioritized risk and established a business case. You have reviewed the cost benefit analysis or the ROI of the risk response options. And now comes the stage to design and implement the control themselves. And this is considered a life cycle approach for control implementation. Okay. Now controls can be classified into two basic categories. The first one being the proactive controls, which are designed to prevent an incident, and they are considered as safeguards. And there can be reactive controls too, which help you in detection, in containment, and in the recovery. And these are considered countermeasures. While designing of controls, the most important aspect is that the controls are most effective when they are designed to reduce vulnerabilities. If you see, risk is basically a function of threat and vulnerability, and this is something that we'll see in the coming slides as well. Risk is determined through threats and vulnerability. And so what and threat basically tries and exploit the vulnerability. So if you reduce the vulnerabilities, or if you have your controls designed in a manner that reduce the vulnerabilities, what you are essentially doing is that you are reducing the risk surface itself. Okay. So what are the three kind of controls that we have over here? The first one being the administrative controls. These are more of the soft controls, as they are oriented from the management in the form of certain directives and policies. And quite often it's the administrative controls which drive the need for incorporating technical and the physical controls. The examples are your policies, procedures, your hiring practices, your background checks, etc. Then you have your logical and the technical controls. Now, these involve the hardware and the software mechanisms that you manage to access and provide protection for resources and systems. You have the examples in the form of authentication methods, your encryption mechanisms, your IDS, your protocols and the firewalls. The third tools that you have, let me have the other participants as well. So the third kind of control are the physical controls. These are put in place to protect the facility, the personnel, or the resources as well. Now, there seem to be confusion often between the logical or the physical controls, or the technical or the physical controls, because if you check the example, a firewall itself could be a physical control as well, but the purpose of the firewall is not to protect a particular facility. Okay, not a physical facility. So what happens is that usually it is easier to define physical controls as those items that you can physically touch, but they do not mean firewalls or the IDS or any any technical solutions. These are largely the technical controls, not the physical controls. So some of the examples for the physical controls are, you have your guards, fences. So you have your guards, your fencing that is done, your motion detectors, your video cameras. These are some of the physical controls that need to be put in place. Now, all these three kinds of controls that I've discussed over here, they need to be put in place to provide a defense in depth mechanism, which is the coordinated use of multiple security controls in a layered approach. And this should further strengthen the need for having a strong risk management practices in place within an organization, because when you choose to implement any technical controls, let's assume a firewall or an email filtering solution, you have to undergo a risk management cycle, which is more of an administrative control itself. And from there on, you will make a determination that we need to have a technical control in place, which is a firewall or a email filtering solution. But the story does not end, and there you also need to put in place the physical controls to prevent any abuse or malpractice to your technical controls. So your technical controls are put in place to achieve a specific business objective, and your physical security controls are meant to guard your technical controls besides serving other purposes that they are designed for. So this is an example of defense in depth approach. Now, under these three controls, you have other controls as well, which can be deterrent, which can be preventive, detective, compensating, corrective, recovery, and directive. So deterrent is controls are meant to discourage the violation of security policies. Now, if you see over here, policies and security awareness training, these are essentially what? These are administrative controls, but they are falling under the subset of deterrent controls. If you check the example of locks, fences, guards, these are what? These are the physical controls, but they are meant to do what? They are meant to deter But again, it also depends in how you have structured your controls in a layered approach, or in a defense in depth mechanism, because these locks can also be they can also be placed with a purpose to prevent a certain abuse. Preventive controls are meant to stop any unwanted or unauthorized activities from occurring. Again, if you see fences as being repeated away, so it depends how you have configured your controls, how you have uh, placed your controls in a layered manner. Biometrics are meant to prevent any kind of abuse as well of your passwords. Again, supplementing a certain control. This is often seen as part for multi-factor authentication. Then you have your job rotation. Job rotation, again, part of your administrative controls, but falling under preventive category. Data classification, again, your administrative controls. Now you have the other categories over here, which are detective, again, meant to discover or detect any unwanted activity. Uh, See, these are the audit trails that I was referring to earlier. These are the detective controls. Then you have your CCTV cameras, again, physical controls falling under the detective category. Job rotation or mandatory vacations, physical administrative controls falling under the detective categories. Then you have your compensating controls, corrective controls, recovery, and directive. I won't spend too much time on this because these are essentially quite self-explanatory. You'll have these information with you, this piece of information with you, so you can go through this. And if you have any questions on this, you can raise it over here, and I'll try and answer them. So let me go to the next slide. Now, this is the representation. Now, if you see all the colored items, this is where these are directly related to your risk. You have a threat event which is created through a certain threat. The threat event tries and exploit the vulnerability. As I was saying earlier, that your risk is emanates basically from a function of risk is a function of threat and vulnerability. And the impact over here, this is a risk event. Okay, your vulnerability results into a certain impact, and these are the various controls that you can employ. So what your compensating controls does is that it reduces the likelihood of a threat event. Your corrective controls can decrease the impact. Your preventive controls can reduce either the impact or they can protect the vulnerability for being exploited. You have your detective controls, which can trigger the preventive controls, or they can help you in the discovery of the threat event. Then you have your deterrent controls, which reduce the likelihood of a threat event. Okay, now what are the types of risk? Now, in order to assess and respond to any risk that lies outside the organizational risk appetite, the risk practitioner needs to have an ability to distinguish between inherent and other kinds of risk. The first one that I want to discuss is the inherent risk. It is the level of risk or exposure without taking into account the actions that the management has taken in the form of certain control implementation. So this is the inherent risk. Inherent risk is the risk that exists as it is without having implemented any kind of a control before. Then the residual risk is the leftover risk. It's the risk that remains after the management has implemented a certain risk response. But this can also include the risk that is left over after you have had an insurance cover or after you have adopted risk transfer as a risk response option. How residual risk is can be calculated? It can be calculated through inherent risk, subtracting inherent risk, control gaps, which is the cost of the controls from the inherent risk, and then you will have the residual risk. I doubt that the exam would test you on any calculation, but this is just for to help you understand how the residual risk is calculated. Now the question is that when is the residual risk is supposed to be accepted? Now, if you see, if the residual risk with a particular control is within the risk appetite of the organization, then the residual risk can be accepted. If it is within the risk appetite of the organization, then it can be accepted. Otherwise, you need to have an additional response. If you can have some compensating controls to reduce the risk further. However, if the residual risk is considered unacceptable by the management, then that particular risk should be avoided. Now, what you have is, now if you see again, we developed the risk response, then we developed a risk action plan, then we checked what are the various controls that we have. Now we are coming to the system design and the implementation. So whenever any particular controls are designed, they have to undergo a particular a comprehensive testing program, which can entail your unit testing, your integration testing, your UAT or user acceptance testing, or your quality assurance. So in unit testing, you are performing a modular testing, the testing of each modules, and integration testing, you try and test the integration of those modules together. In the user acceptance testing, you are checking how whether the entire system fulfills the requirements that you had put forward, and the quality assurance is something that I will discuss as well now. Now, this is something extremely important for me to share with all of you, because I think this might be a question that may feature on the exam in reworded in some other manner. So what is the difference between a user acceptance testing and a quality assurance? The purpose of a UAT is to verify that the system meets the user requirements, that your feature requirement specifications are being fulfilled by the system that has been designed. So whatever feature requirement specifications that you had mentioned over there, is it fulfilling your needs or not? So a failure in UAT suggests that there is a flaw in the organization's process for assessing the requirements itself. It tells you that the organization is not mature enough to put forward its feature requirement specifications. However, quality assurance addresses whether the project delivered what it promised in the design, and it does not tell whether the design actually meets the user's requirements or the expectations. So a failure in the quality assurance suggests that there was some kind of a flaw in the organization's process for development and execution. So bear in mind that this is quite, these are closely related to each other. So you have to be well versed in this part. Now, if you trace back our discussion from where we had actually begun, you may recall that we started off with the results which we had gathered from risk analysis, which provided us a kind of a risk map in terms of risk that exceeded the risk appetite of the organization. And then we decided that which risk responses we had to take in the form of risk acceptance, mitigation, avoiding, etc. So after determining the risk response, we decided to implement the controls, which the controls could have been administrative, technical, or physical controls. And these were supposed to be in a structured or a layered approach, which could provide us a defensive mechanism. Then we discussed how these controls are to be designed and tested. And now comes the phase for rolling them out into production. So how do you roll them out? What are the changeover techniques? That is something that I'm going to discuss as last part of this domain. So you have three approaches basically. One is the parallel approach, in which you have both the new and the old systems running simultaneously. So you can have your new system handling 30% of the traffic and your old system handling 70% of the traffic. So it provides you a greater reliability to test the new system, and once you are sure that your system is running as your expectations are, so you can start transferring the traffic gradually. So it has a minimized risk of failed changeover, but it has a higher cost of maintenance, because in this case you have to maintain both the systems in parallel. In phased manner, you are replacing the individual components or the modules of the old system with the new components. essentially the same challenges appear in the phased changeover technique as in the parallel system, because you have there's a larger IT resource consumption. You have to maintain two environments with distinct hardware and the software. So, and what you do is that you try and you replace the older systems gradually in a phased manner. The third one is considered the abrupt changeover, and this is the most risky one. And because in this case, what happens is that in a single movement, you're moving all your existing traffic from your old system to your new system. And this is considered the most risky because, again, it has a potential for a loss opportunities. Because if there happens to be any failed changeover, then if there happens to be any business disruption, then you have your financial loss associated with this. But this is more prevalent in cases where rollback is assured, where you have a complete rollback or a fallback plan in place, and your fallback plan has a risk-based approach in it. So you can, and you have certain milestones within your rollback mechanism. So this can help you in adopting this abrupt changeover technique, and you can start shifting the traffic in one go. And this can also be adopted in those cases where the impact of business loss is largely is quite minor. So these are the three changeover techniques. So this is all from my side from this domain. If you have any questions, you can ask me, and I'll try and answer those questions over here.
Hi, Muneeb, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can.
Okay, this is Raza. I have a question here. Can you explain residual or inherent risk by example, and what's the core or main difference?
So, I'll go back to the example, to the same example that I had mentioned earlier at the starting of the session, where I gave the example of traveling intercity through car. So your car has, so as I mentioned, that if your car wheels have wear and tear on them, okay, and you decide to travel on the intercity. So right now, so what options do you have when you realize that your car wheels have wear and tear on them? You have the option of either taking an insurance cover, or you have the option of accepting the risk, or you can decide not to travel, or what you can do is that you can basically what you can do is that you can decide to replace the wheels of the car, correct? If you decide that, okay, I'll just, my budget allows me that I can only replace the front wheels of my car. So what you have done is that you have reduced the risk. Okay, earlier you had your four tires that had wear and tear on them, but now you have replaced the front wheels, but you have left the rear wheels as it is. So the risk that is associated with your rear wheels is still there. So this is considered as your residual risk, the risk that is left over after implementing a certain control. What was the control that you implemented? The control that you implemented was that you had replaced the wheels, the front wheels. So this was a control that you implemented. But prior to implementing of this control, whatever risk was there, this was your inherent risk. This was the risk that existed prior to the implementation of the controls. If you check this slide, you can see inherent risk is the risk that exists prior to the implementation of controls, and residual risk is the risk that exists after the implementation of a risk response. Is there any other question from any of the participants? Okay, if there's no other questions, then I'll stop this session. I thank you all for attending the session, and if there are any questions, you can get back to me on my LinkedIn profile. I'll be more than happy to answer you. Be sure that I will definitely answer the questions that you'll send to me, and I wish you good luck in your preparation for the CRISC examination, and see you then next week for the last session of the CRISC domain. Thank you so much.